matters, the distinctions we create always have violent effects. They have still conceded our wheelchair dancer evidence, which indicates that the logic of ableist oppression always founds itself upon how language is used to subjugate certain populations, which means that the violence that they create is one where we start to internalize it, where we don't actually question it, we make it so that it is insidious. This is the parallel I drew about how racism and sexism are active forms of discrimination. However, the discrimination of people with disabilities is one that is a passive one. It is one where you don't realize that the words we're using can be considered ableist by certain populations. This is our entire argument that we need to bring to the fore. Why people with disabilities consider things such as the use of blindness metaphors to be incredibly problematic. Why I consider it to be a slur in my own personal life. Now, this also answers all of their arguments about how we are colonizing them, because they have conceded the Turns case argument that they are is an act of colonization against my own body, against my own own eyes, because it is an example of how that colonialist logic recreates violence, which means the alternative is reconceptualization, i.e. saying that the affirmative is saying we can do the entirety affirmative absent the problematic metaphors is the only way to create real forms of change. Now, you should accept our charity evidence. Continued violence against those with disabilities dooms the affirmative project. They've conceded the other Turns case argument that making ableist language apparent is a prior question of the 1AC's ability to be productive, which is also a sequencing argument to the entirety of the affirmative. They don't have a solvency test to the alternative, which means there's only a risk that our engagement with the 1AC is a better one than the affirmative, because it only makes it so that the revolution will not be said by argument that the revolution that they create, or that how the actual creates survival strategy will not be accessible for that will not be accessible. I think this is also pretty well fleshed out when he says that discussing the idea of how the tree is relative, saying that he's not able to be whole. Our argument is that the understanding of wholeness and how we actually engage in wholeness in the context of the disabled body is problematic, because I have been told my entire life that I am defective. I have been told that I am not whole. I have been told that I am not able to occupy those spaces. However, the affirmative continues that violence. Now, their argument that I am the colonizer does not mean that the discussions we have about ableist language and the ability to castigate ableist language should still come first. It is not just about my experience, but also the experience of those who have been castigated in the debate community, and how we have actually made it apparent our charity evidence that the rhetoric of ableism is so pervasive, it is so everywhere, that we need to actually question it in every instance we actually engage in. So they've conceded the argument that society is shaped and created around ableism. This is the weakness of the 1AC's project. It also means we access the role of the ballot argument. They say, how do we actually create better change for indigenous populations? Well, our argument is that only understanding that there are different bodies and different ways of operating in bodies, that the use of blindness as a metaphor is a problematic one. Now, our argument condenses down to they made the distinction between how disability has been created in the context of whether the disability has been created around Western subjectivity. However, our argument is that when they say Western subjectivity, there is a distinction here between ableist language and the active example of disability discrimination they talk about. Our argument is that they address that, but they do not address the understanding of ableist language that makes their project impossible. Now, the argument about disability studies, they are not Western. I am speaking from my own lived experience. Yes, this may be a Western experience that I have engaged in. Yes, I may be an immigrant son from Europe, but that does not mean that there is a reason why they should be colonizing my experience. It also probably proves the fact that only the alternative is able to create progressive solutions that the affirmative is not able to engage in. Now, listen, they do not have a permutation at any point in this debate, which you should not allow them to say they access any part of our alternative. Additionally, the words that they have said are not changeable. They are static. They have a set meaning that I have interpreted. It is not a question of what they thought what they meant to say, but it is how I have interpreted and how I have been offended, which means that they have not been able to access any of those arguments. Also, the alternative of actually questioning why we use things like blindness as a metaphor, or using ableist language as a metaphor, even if it is well-intentioned, even if it seems innocent, even if we think it is not that big of a deal. Questioning those assumptions is the only way to create a truly possible revolution, or a truly possible way of engagement with the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world, also all of the arguments on the other flows about how we're an example of colonizing logic, the alternative would resolve these arguments, because it says that there are many different forms of ability, i.e. that we should not use metaphors as the metaphor of blindness, but also that all of our arguments are not examples of us actually colonizing them. Instead, is a way of testing the different arguments we have made. However, our argument that my performance of disability is inextricably linked to me as a person means that they cannot possibly make an argument that the affirmative is a prerequisite to their engagement, because the one thing I cannot be divorced from, independent of everything, is my ability to is how my eyes actually operate, the sight with which I mean myself, which is something that the affirmative cannot effectively operate in. The affirmative is not a prerequisite, it is the other way around. Only we are reading evidence on this question. Our second piece of charity evidence said that social justice projects, or the ability to actually hold things like discrimination, which occurs to stop things like the to stop things like what the 1AC talks about are only possible insofar as we make that example accessible. You should think about it like this. Debate is an activity. Debate is an activity where we discuss the merits of democracy, we discuss the merits of inclusion, we discuss the merits of how we create change. But now imagine that we are all debating about this and there is no access ramps, there is no interpreters for those who are blind and cannot understand, those who are blind and who cannot actually read things that are written up on the board. There are no interpreter for those who are deaf. There is there's no commendation for people who have differences, people who have disabilities, because these are the things we do not think about. We don't make change in the possibility, but I believe that we probably can, which means the alternative is a better starting point for creating that change. We still, they say it's a question of how they actually create survival strategies for them as debaters. Our argument is that this is a better way to live, is a survival strategy, because the only way to create other forms of political coalition for the 1AC to be effective, for this debate round to matter, is to actually socially castigate things like ableist language. If you concede it, you have to reject it when presented with it, because it actually grounds our community. It's something we don't think about. It is something that always is on the back burner of our lived existence, which means that even if I am a settler, the language we still use matters, which means that their arguments don't make sense. Context is their alternative of engaging the 1AC, allowing them to create that change is the only way to actually create change. All of our arguments are doesn't super blends.